Hey everyone, welcome to From Dusk Till Dawn. My name's Steve, and today we're talking slashers. Now, when most people think about slasher films, they're thinking about Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, films like that, and generally the period in the 80s when they were really at the height of their popularity. For me, though, I think that the birth of the slasher started much earlier. And I want to talk to you about two films that were both released in 1960. They were both controversial on release. They're both about a disturbed killer, funnily enough. And both of them featured ideas or scenes that would become the tropes of the slasher film. So I want to talk to you today about 1960's Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, and also from the same year, Michael Powell's Peeping Tom. So just to set the context of where horror was at the point that Psycho and Peeping Tom came out in 1960, before then, mostly horror was focused around kind of the classic monsters, the Universal monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster. You'd got Hammer that were just starting out, doing their take on the Hammer horrors with the Gothics as well. And then they also had, in the 50s, there was the period where we moved away from a lot of the monsters and the supernatural, and we went more into science fiction. I think it was the nuclear age. You know, they'd used the bombs during the end of the Second World War. So we got a lot of nuclear type mutations, giant ants and stuff like that, the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, the Blob. And then we also get, you also get the fear of communism. There was the big, the red threat was very, very, it was an era of paranoia, particularly in America. And so what filmmakers did was they basically substituted the threat of a takeover from communism by alien invasion. So you had that whole thread of horror, but again, it was detached from reality, really. But then we get to 1960, and when we get to 1960, we've started to find people, real life people like Ed Gein, who was a killer. I think his nickname was the Butcher of Plainfield. He was the chap who was part of the inspiration for Norman Bates and Psycho, for the Texas Chainsaw Family, Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. That brought horror home. That brought a dose of reality to why you can create all these fantastic creatures and situations. There is stuff going on at home. And these weren't monsters. They were just people. They could be your neighbour. So that's where we get into the kind of the killer next door type thing that we look at with Norman Bates. So that's just a bit of a sort of a whirlwind stop as to where horror was around the time that these two films came out. Now, I'm not going to do a complete run through for both of these films. Christ knows there's enough videos out there about Psycho, probably about Peeping Tom as well, although it's slightly less well known than Psycho. That everybody knows it. I mean, even if you haven't seen Psycho, you know all the beats from it, which is kind of the point that we're getting to here. So with Psycho, you've got the trope of killing off your lead character. Janet Leigh is introduced at the beginning of the film. We think she's going to be the main protagonist. We follow her through the crime that she's trying to get away with. She pulls into the Bates Motel. We see Norman Bates, who is the motel owner. How's he going to get involved? We don't really know. After about 35, 40 minutes, we know exactly how he's going to be involved, and our lead is killed off. Done and dusted. And that sets you up going, well, if that's the person that I know and they're in danger, anyone can die. And this is a trope that's repeated really famously. It's done in Scream, at the beginning of Scream, with that fantastic opening with Drew Barrymore. Drew Barrymore all over the promotional posters for Scream. You know, you saw her eyes there and everything. 15 minutes into the film, she's Harry Browners, she's gone. Alien was another one. It was a largely unknown cast, really, at the time that Alien came out. With only really Tom Skerritt known as Dallas, first one to go in that when they're facing the monster. Obviously, John Hurt goes before that, but you know when you're actually facing the antagonist, you think that he's going to be your hero character. No, he's gone, so everybody's back in danger. So that was a trope that Hitchcock introduced into Psycho that has become replicated as we go through the slasher films. Another aspect from Psycho that was introduced that would become a trope in slashers, again in my opinion, the vulnerable female victim. So again, Marion Crane, Janet Leigh's character, she's a young woman. She is isolated. She's separated from anyone who can keep her safe. And she's effectively stalked by a killer. And this is literally every single slasher film that followed up and through the 80s. You kind of had that one character that was going to be the vulnerable female. They're going to get isolated. They're on their own. As we get into sort of later slasher films, you know, the more danger they're in, the less clothes they seem to be wearing. But again, and you know, when you look at Marion Crane's death scene in Psycho, obviously the very famous shower scene, it comes from there. She's naked. Obviously in 1960 you couldn't show that, or you could, but it wouldn't be allowed. But as attitudes relaxed, that is also introduced into the lone female victim. So that's another trope that I think Psycho has started. And then we come to the weapons that are used. Norman Bates is just a normal person. He doesn't have fangs or claws to bite or maul a victim. He's not supernatural. He doesn't take a potion and become a hulking brute or get hit by lightning and become this really strong, aggressive person. He's the chap next door who uses a cook's knife, a butcher's knife, which nearly every household has got something very, very similar. This is something that would become an established trope. Michael Myers loves a butcher's knife. As we go through various different series of slasher films, more everyday items become used. You know, Jason using a corkscrew in part 4. Axe, that's a classic. You know, chainsaw, we'll come to that. But these are all objects that most people would have in their home that could be used to kill somebody. And, you know, Psycho wasn't the first with it, but it's the one that made that the popular trope. Now, you can't really talk about Psycho without talking about the shower scene. That is Psycho to most people. When you think of Psycho, they're going to see the image of Marion in the shower, the knife coming up, the curtain going back, and then we get the famous score and the knife coming down. That set piece is one of the most famous and, in my opinion, most brilliant pieces of filmmaking since film began. So we've got the creation of the murder set piece. That, as we know, actually became the reason most people started to go to see slasher films. How creative can you get with the kills? How can we build it up? Even going into the sort of the torture era, the Saw films and everything. That is the whole build up, the suspense of it. And in Psycho, you've got the whole build up to the shower scene. The way that is scored and edited is just a masterclass in filmmaking. Of course it is. So you've got that big murder set piece, and we've also got misdirection in there as well. There's that fantastic shot that's kind of looking down, and you've got Arbogast, the detective, who's searching the Bates house, and he goes in one direction, walks the other way, and Mrs. Bates comes out behind him and stabs him. and then you get that great shot of him falling down the stairs. Mrs. Bates comes from a direction you're not expecting. That is another trope. You know, it got to the point where somebody would close a door and the killer stood behind there. Well, then it evolved into you close the door, you're expecting the killer to be there, they're not. Then as somebody turns around, bang, that's when you get it. So it's that misdirection. That was something that was really evident in Psycho as well. So another trope chalked off. Now, when it comes to Peeping Tom, it's not quite as well known as Psycho. Directed by Michael Powell, the same Michael Powell from Powell and Pressburger, so making films like The Red Shoes. All of a sudden comes this film that is arguably more like a slasher than Psycho is. It's set in London. It's very, for me as well, it's kind of got the roots of Giallo, the sort of things that were happening in the Italian Giallo films, particularly Blood and Black Lace, which was 4 years later, 1964, by Mario Bava, in that it's a very bright environment. The colours are kind of hyper realistic. So you had Psycho in black and white, and quite muted. This is quite a vibrant looking film, and it focuses on Mark Lewis, who is a photographer and cameraman. And this, the real trope that this gives us, in my opinion, is the killer's point of view. Long before we get Michael Myers putting on his little clown mask and stalking his sister, you've got Mark Lewis looking through the lens of his camera. You've got the crosshairs of the viewfinder heading towards his victims, and you can see the terror on their faces. And that's kind of why he does what he does and how he does it, is because he wants to capture that fear of death and photograph that. So we're often seeing everything through his eyes, and it's that causes a lot of issues with slasher films, because it's like audience participation. So I'm not saying that Peeping Tom's the first film to do point of view shots like that, but for me it's the one that is most recognisable for what would later become the point of view shots of the killers in slasher films. A link to that point of view shot is another element that would become a trope, and that's stalking your victim. Slashers were often called stalk and slash as well. In Peeping Tom, the stalking becomes a part of it. You see Mark observing his victims, he studies them, he records them on his camera, follows them, and then he gets them into the position where he eventually murders them. So it's almost like the stalking part is as important as the killing part when it comes to the film. And I think that's something that we see certainly in a film like Halloween or Black Christmas. It's very much part of what's going on in those films. It's a hugely important part, is when we see the killers observing their victims. So yet another slasher trope that we can tick off. Now, this next one is common to Peeping Tom and to Psycho, and it becomes much more evident as a slasher trope as we go through the ages, and that is the psychological killer. There's something that's happened in their life. There's been trauma in the past with both Norman Bates and Mark Lewis. It's related to their family and the relationships that they have, Norman with his mother and Mark with his father. And we see that in Peeping Tom. We see Mark as a kid with his dad, played by Michael Powell. But you can see that they're damaged from that. They're traumatized from it. They get their obsessions from the way that they were brought up, the way that they were treated as children. You'll find that familiar with everyone from Billy in Black Christmas. You know, there's issues going on there. Of course, with Michael Myers, we know that there's family trauma going on there. So it's not unusual to see that it is the upbringing that has almost caused them to act in the way that they do. It's become a real cliche, but we're going all the way back to 1960 to see, in my opinion, where it was first brought to the forefront of how somebody was acting. I already mentioned this next point earlier, talking about Peeping Tom. It's that audience participation. So again, it's that point of view making us look through the killer's eyes. It's making the audience complicit in the act of killing. And I think that that's a really important aspect that comes into the slasher film. We see it all the time, quite often through a mask. So you'll just see the eye holes, you'll hear the heavy breathing. But for me, that's really got its roots in Peeping Tom. Mike uses his camera to film everything. The murder weapon, he's got like a stiletto blade on an arm underneath his camera that sticks out. And as he's going towards his victims, the blade's getting closer and closer. So you get the classic kind of from his victims as the knife goes into their neck there. Again, that was the source of much of the controversy. Because it's making the audience member feel like they are a part of the crime. So, although I mentioned it before, I will just bring that out again because I think that's an important point, and certainly leads to a lot of the controversy surrounding slasher films. So that is audience complicity. So which of these films is the most influential on the slasher genre? Well, I think it's fair to say the reception of both was very, very different. Psycho became a massive hit. It was a cultural phenomenon. It was, very famously, Hitchcock had the signs put up saying that nobody will be admitted once the film had started, purely because they didn't want it spoiled with the whole thing that was going on with Marion. It did basically change horror cinema. Lots of people will say it's not a horror film, and I get that argument, but it brought it home. It gave it a face, and it was the face of the person next door. And it's inspired filmmakers. It's been parodied, it's been copied, its influence is undeniable. Peeping Tom, on the other hand, when that came out, it was initially hated. There were some really strong reviews written about it. It basically destroyed Michael Powell's career. It was such was the backlash against this that it finished him off, basically. But it became reevaluated later on. One of its biggest fans is Martin Scorsese. His editor, Thelma Schoonmaker, was married to Michael Powell. And Martin Scorsese is a huge Powell and Pressburger fan. And it's thanks to him that we actually get the 4K restoration that we've got. This was put out by the BFI on Studio Canal. It is a wonderful, wonderful 4K transfer of a wonderful film. I urge you to watch this one. You've probably all got Psycho, you've probably all seen it, but seriously, folks, go and watch this. This is superb. And as I say, the restoration on that is brilliant, and that's thanks to Martin Scorsese. I will also say that Peeping Tom, I think, probably has more of the slasher influences in it than Psycho, just without realising it. But you watch this back and they are all there. Psycho. Now, Arrow did a beautiful 4K set, but me being the dumbass that I am, didn't get back into physical media collecting until just after that had been released, so I missed out on it. So I've got the standalone 4K of Psycho. This is proof that 4K with HDR and black and white is a marriage made in heaven. This is an absolutely stunning, stunning transfer on here. There can't be too many people that have not seen Psycho, so we won't talk too much more about that. But I did get the 4K of the Psycho sequels. So Peeping Tom, standalone film. Psycho led to 3 sequels. And I actually love all of them, even the 4th one. But the second one in particular, Psycho 2, is a really, really strong film. It's so much better than you remember. Psycho 3 is also really, really interesting, and that was directed by Anthony Perkins himself. And then we get Psycho 4 in here, where we get the backstory to Norman Bates, played by Henry Thomas of E.T. fame, and Mrs. Bates, played by Black Christmas's Olivia Hussey. Interestingly, we'll talk about Black Christmas in a moment. So were Psycho and Peeping Tom the originators of the slasher genre? I don't know. If you watch them, as we've just talked about, all of the tropes are there. We've got the isolated victims, we've got elaborate kill sequences, killer's point of view, psychologically damaged killers. It's all there. But were they the first to do it? Probably not. Were they the ones to make it popular? I think they were. But the modern slasher as we know it, I think it goes to, I think you need to look to, most people would say Halloween, but I think that you need to look before that, perhaps to Black Christmas, which I just mentioned Olivia Hussey there. Or you could even go before that. Well, I mentioned Mario Bava earlier on, and Blood and Black Lace, which is an Italian giallo film and is a cracking film as well, because that plays up on the really elaborate kill sequences. That's what giallo became famous for, the kind of suspenseful, really elaborate, over-the-top death sequences. But after Blood and Black Lace, if you go to 1970, or was it 71? 71, somebody will correct me, I'm sure. And you've got Bava's Bay of Blood, which, although that is a giallo, it's also got everything that we've just talked about, plus what we will recognise as more slasher-like kill sequences. Friday the 13th basically ripped off nearly every kill in Bay of Blood 10 years later. It's all there. The graphic kills, there's kind of a sleazier element to it. You've got those point of view shots and everything. So that's before Black Christmas. But the way that I kind of see it, I would say that while Psycho and Peeping Tom didn't create the slasher as we know it, it gave us the foundation. Black Christmas has refined that, and then maybe, I think it's fair to say, Halloween perfected it. So tell me what you think. Do you think that Psycho and Peeping Tom were the start of the slasher film? Was it Black Christmas? Was it Halloween? Was there something, an obscure Russian film from the 30s that I've forgotten to mention about? Tell me, I'd love to hear from it. For what it's worth, some of my favourite slashers. Yes, my favourite series is always going to be Friday the 13th. Jason is my boy. I do like the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Halloween, obviously. Black Christmas, I love. I do really like The Burning. I think Maniac is a cracking film. But for me, my favourite traditional slasher has got to go to 1981's My Bloody Valentine. I think that has everything, and if you can, get the Scream Factory 4K edition of that, because it is brilliant. It's a brilliant transfer. It's got all, I say all the uncut scenes, it hasn't, but it's got the majority of the censored footage put back in, and unlike the Blu-ray release that Scream Factory put out, where there was really noticeable dip in quality in the 4K, it's all really, really good. So those are my opinions, but I'd love to hear yours, so let me know in the comments below. And I think that's everything that I've got for you this time. So thank you very much for watching From Dusk Till Dawn. My name's Steve, and I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.
Well, what do we do?
Why don't we just wait here for a little while? See what happens.